Charlie Kirk was an incredible human being who was cut down. When they run out of the ability to debate, they turn to violence. Charlie Kirk was a hero. He had the courage to speak the truth and not use violence, but rather intellect, rather discourse, reasonable conversations. I think that anybody who's outspoken after seeing that horrible scene of when just the moment when you heard the pop and then you saw the blood coming out of his neck, this wasn't just about Charlie Kirk. This is about silencing the truth. Is Israel committing genocide?
I like how you've warmed me up with a really easy question. The British government doesn't think Israel's committing genocide.
Piers Morgan has become the shit disturber now. He said that what is happening today was not the original intent. Now it's just gone out of control.
I'm concerned at the moment that there is a kind of an attrition going on here that doesn't necessarily have a particularly clear end state.
Do you think Hamas can survive this?
I think so. For the simple reason that they've had, since 2004, to infest every part of Gazan life with Hamas loyalists.
My name is Israel Ellis, and this is The Unfiltered View, a companion to the wake-up call. This is where truth breaks through the noise.
Today with us is Andrew Fox. He is formerly a paratrooper with the British Army. He has done 3 tours in Afghanistan between 2008 and 2010. He has since become an expert in military strategy. He is a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy. And Andrew has been to Gaza also for 3 tours. And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. Andrew Fox, welcome to The Unfiltered View, and thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start it off. Let's get spicy.
Let's do it.
Is Israel committing genocide?
I like how you've warmed me up with a really easy question, because it is an easy question. Actually, I'm joking. It's a big issue, but it is an easy answer. Clearly, no. Even the British government this week released their internal paperwork saying that the British government doesn't think Israel's committing genocide, and they come to the right conclusion that it's because there's no intent whatsoever. If we look at South Africa's case in the ICJ, and I'm intimately familiar with that initial finding, having read it several times, unfortunately for me, you'll see that all the evidence of intent they give are either from politicians who are well outside of the decision making for the war, or they simply cherry pick out of context quotes from President Herzog, from the Prime Minister, from the former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, and there's just no coherent intent here. So if we look at genocide law, we're looking for something called a dolus specialis, which is effectively the burden of proof that a prosecution has to prove. So if you and I ended up in civilian courts, it would be beyond reasonable doubt. If we ended up in a non-criminal court, it's normally balance of probabilities, so it's kind of 51%. Dolus specialis means it has to be only genocide, and that's the only possible thing it could be. And if you look at all of the behavior of Israel during this war, feeding Gaza's population, allowing aid in, creating humanitarian zones where there have been hardly any scenes of military action. So all of that points to the fact it's a war and not a genocide.
And I'm just confused because there's a lot of smart people out there. There's a lot of smart people. We think they're smart, at least in government. There's leaders of countries, and there are media personalities. And it just seems that this whole situation with Israel and the IDF and what's going on in Gaza has gone on so long that there seems to be a bit of a reversal of narrative. Piers Morgan has, really has become the shit disturber now, and seems to have become quite negative towards Israel. And then you've got, sort of political leadership accusing Israel of all sorts of things. And you hear, when I was listening to Piers the other day, and he said, well, at the beginning after October 7th, I really, sided with Israel, but this has gone on way too long. And I believe if I correctly heard him correctly, he said that what is happening today was not the original intent, or was not the intent of what was supposed to happen, and now it's just gone out of control. And I'm like, okay, but we're still fighting a war. We still have Hamas. We still have terrorists who are announcing openly that they want to kill us. So, when you're talking about strategy and you're talking about warfare, and you've served in Afghanistan, that's a whole, long drawn out conflict there. Is Israel sort of outside of their initial objectives over here? Are they out of line, or is what is happening now all part of that trajectory? And does it make military reasonable sense? What is happening? Israel is defending itself. And does that still hold true in your opinion? And from a military strategist, would you say that Israel is in the right or the wrong?
I don't think it's a matter of right and wrong when we're looking at strategy. I think we're looking at, first of all, is the plan achievable? Secondly, do you have the resources to properly resource the plan? Do you have a coherent pattern of priorities that you've organized your plan into to make sure you achieve your strategic goal? And I think there are, question marks for me at this point over where Israel's going with this. I was briefed in the Kiryat, it must have been July last year, and the military plan briefed to me then is rather different to the one that's happening on the ground now. So there's certainly been a shift in strategy and a shift in operational design, as we call it. And that presents challenges to any military, because the whole point of using armed force is to achieve a political goal. The end of a military operation is not the end. It's working to contribute towards your political strategy. And I think it's somewhat unclear where this war is going at the moment. Like, what does it look like once the fighting has stopped? Who's going to run Gaza? Who is, what's going to happen to Hamas? Because you're not going to destroy every last member of Hamas. So what happens to the people who are the administrators, the judges, the police, even the fighters who've just dropped their weapons and blended into the civilian population? What happens to them? How do you deal with that problem? So I'm concerned at the moment that there is a kind of an attrition going on here that doesn't necessarily have a particularly clear end state. And that, I think, is a problem militarily. And we talked about Afghanistan. That's exactly what happened to us. We went in initially in 2001, and it's 9/11 today as we speak. We went in after that to destroy Al-Qaeda. That quickly turned into a sort of nation-building mission. At times we were told we were doing counter-narcotics, and then that got abandoned to do nation-building and counterinsurgency. So we had this 20 years of strategic drift in Afghanistan where there was never really a clear political end state. And I think that's the big danger for what Israel's doing in Gaza at the moment, because destroy Hamas, you're not going to kill and destroy the entire thing. You might dismantle it, you might degrade it so it can't hurt Israel anymore. Destroying it completely is extremely challenging.
Do you think Hamas can survive this?
Yeah, I think so. For the simple reason that they've had, since 2004 to infest every part of Gazan life with Hamas loyalists. So we look at the Ministry of Health. They're clearly working towards a war aim with the stuff they're pushing out. They are Hamas loyalists. They're working to Hamas's plan. We look at the judges system. We look at UNRWA. Like, everything in Gaza is Hamas. The kind of anti-Israel crowd online like to make that joke where they go, "Oh, you're just saying that everything's Hamas." Well, it is in Gaza. That's the stupid thing. So how do you physically uproot something that is so deeply entrenched in the entirety of the society? And how do you then, on top of that, deal with this, the idea of what Einat Wilf calls Palestinianism, which is the idea of the river to the sea, Israel exists no more, something else takes its place. You look at the opinion polling coming out of the Judea, Samaria, and the West, and Gaza. Hamas they would win an election tomorrow in the West Bank, and it wouldn't even be close. The broader population still hate Israel, still think as a majority that 7th of October was the right thing to do. You've got entrenched attitudes here. And then on top of that, we have to layer the Muslim Brotherhood aspect, which sits well outside the borders of Gaza itself. We see military headquarters supporting Hamas in Turkey. We see the financial flows that come from Qatar. Whether or not the leadership's been killed or not, we still don't know who the consolidated list of fatalities there is. But there's still certainly people who are Hamas leaders there. Yeah, exactly. And so
if you whack one, another comes up. You said something really interesting, actually. You said that the point of this military operation, if I got it correctly, the question is it achieving political objectives? I thought that was very interesting because to me, as a non-military expert, I'm thinking, is this military action defending Israel? Is it making Jews safer in the world? Is it achieving my objectives, are safety and my concern for safety and security for the citizens? You mentioned political, which is kind of interesting. And I suppose that ultimately, when it comes down to it, any kind of military action from any sovereign state is going to have a political directive. Do you think that today, the current political leadership, that under Netanyahu, that this objective is being mismanaged?
Look, it's an interesting one because we look at everything that gets leaked out of the cabinet, and you have to be very careful with this stuff because it is not verifiable. It's a leak. It's anonymous. There's no, if you're doing our source analysis, it's actually very difficult to present that as a clear and obvious source. But there is a drumbeat that says even the IDF aren't sure about this current operation. And certainly when I speak to my friends and contacts lower down in the IDF at sort of the soldier level, they're very skeptical, and I think that's reflected in some of the reservist reporting rates that we've seen, which I'm told could be as low as 60% in some cases.
Which is really, sort of unique in the sense that since 1948, I mean, the army and the political powers have always been aligned on what the objectives are for the survival of the state of Israel. And there seems to be a lot of polarization. I believe that, and in my book, The Wake Up Call, I talk about the fact that in that observation of how October 7th happened, I talk about Jewish disunity. I talk about that very polarization, the fact that our enemies are watching. And so, one thing that is expected of the Jewish people, one that certainly is expected of the state of Israel, is unity. And I feel that while there is unity on some respects in terms of the empathy for everything that has happened and the concern, and everyone wants the hostages to come home and everyone wants this war to end, but there definitely seems to be a divide when it comes to what is the right course of action. Now, currently, as we are sitting here right now doing this interview, there's a number of interesting things going on. One of the things is that there's this sort of threat and encourage, take over Gaza City. And there's concerns worldwide about doing that and what's going to happen afterwards. Tell me, do you think that Israel today is making, that the political leadership in Israel is making the correct military decisions, or do you have an alternative? Do you have an idea of what the Israeli military, the political leadership, should be giving direction to the Israeli military today? What do you think the objective should be? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree? And if you disagree with it, tell us what would be your plan.
Well, I'm in agreement with General Gallant. He wrote what I thought was an excellent piece on Substack. I think it came out yesterday or the day before, where he makes the case that actually the priority at the moment should be getting the hostages home, because we're in a position where military action is unlikely to do that. If we look at the military success rates on hostage recovery, it's relatively low compared to the amount of hostages who've been returned through a deal of some kind. And he makes the case that actually once the hostages are home, then you can deal with Hamas. Now, I don't entirely agree with that, because
they know that. Hamas knows that.
Yeah,
so why?
Exactly. So there's no incentive to release all of them.
It's an impossible situation. You're dealing with a culture. You're dealing with an ideology where deception is a key tenet of the jihadism. And so how do you do a deal with somebody whose strategy is to deceive the people that they're doing a deal with? And if you don't have a deal on the table and you are incapable of making a deal with somebody, then isn't the only alternative left military action?
Yeah, and you're at the point there where, if we go back to the political theory, my earlier point, Clausewitz said it best. He said, war is politics with the admixture of other means. So it's all about that political goal. And if we look at what war actually is, it's an act of force to compel your enemy to do your will. Okay, so if you don't have a political goal and you can't compel your enemy, you're in a really sticky situation. And that's where I think we're touching on here, because we've got these two goals. return the hostages, destroy Hamas. How does either of them compel Hamas to your will? How do you make them surrender? How do you make them quit? How do you make them leave Gaza when their entire philosophy is that if they die, that's a good thing because they go to Jannah? Their family will probably die with them. They'll have their virgins. There'll be a martyr. There'll be a shahid. All of these factors play into the realistic course of action that Israel can possibly take.
It's a death call.
Exactly.
And when you're the lover of life, and we are negotiating from a perspective of mad, which has been the political theory over the last 80 years, and that is out the window.
Mm-hmm.
And Israel is being told, do not do this. Do not take over Gaza. Do not continue. Stop the war. What is Israel supposed to do? If you cannot compel Hamas, then what are you supposed to do? As a sovereign nation state, you've got an enemy at your door who has committed themselves to your destruction. You cannot negotiate with them because of their deception. You cannot reason with them because they are the lovers of death. And you're really literally in a rock and a hard place. What is Israel?
And I would argue on top of that.
I mean, other than just bulldoze the place completely.
Which, of course, is illegal under international law. And Hamas know all of this as well. They are not stupid. I mean, there are many, many things they are evil and ruthless and psychotic, but they are not stupid. And they'll have thought through all of these aspects at some point during the war, if not before October the 7th. And this is exactly why Israel is in a strategic pickle at this point, if we're going to be slightly twee about it. This is a real challenge. And this has been, I think, what has plagued the debate, certainly within Israel and within sensible discourses. Stand fast the lunatics who are screeching about genocide. I'm not really interested in them. They don't have anything valuable or useful to contribute to this discussion, quite frankly. But anyone sensible has had to wrestle with this conundrum since nearly for 2 years now, and I have as well. And I often say that I don't have the answer. What I wrote last May in the tablet, I think, holds, where I thought the best most likely outcome was almost a return to October 6th, but with Hamas absolutely degraded beyond any point of being able to attack Israel. Unless you take the Trump plan and you shift all the Gazans out and don't allow them back ever, you have to go further than the Trump plan. Because obviously the Trump plan is they return at some point. But unless you actually just get rid of them all, this problem is insoluble.
I think there are alternatives. And I think money speaks. I mean, I think, offer every Gazan $500,000 to relocate somewhere. I wonder how many of them would take you up on that. You certainly would filter through those who love their families more than the idea of becoming a shihad, a martyr to the cause. And the rest of them, well, you want to stand and fight and face the consequences. Andrew, what do you think the chances are that the hostages will return?
I think they're lower after this week, after Doha. I think the only way they come back is through a negotiated deal. We saw Operation Arnon last year. Fantastic result, but it was a disaster avoided by the skin of the IDF's teeth. That was a very well kind of cited reserve force and a couple of airstrikes away from being a disaster. So I think that was something that I think the reason we've not seen that repeated is because I think it was the lessons learned from that, I suspect, were prohibitive to trying to do it again. So the vast majority of hostages have come home through a deal of some kind. So unless you can find that deal, I'm skeptical that military force.
Netanyahu has made it very clear that any deal has got to include the return of all hostages, not a partial hostage exchange where this just continues on and on. But what do you feel about that?
Netanyahu can make all the demands he wants, but there are two parties to this negotiation. And we're back to that earlier point about compelling your opponent to do your will. It's incredibly difficult to compel Hamas to do anything because their priorities are so twisted, and they are so happy to die, and they're more than happy for the hostages to die if they die as well. So, when you're in this position, Nick Bibi can make all the demands he wants, but there are two sides in a negotiation, and if you want to come to a deal, that means some really ugly choices, ugly, difficult, uncomfortable, and unpopular choices. But it depends where your priority is.
War ultimately is the ugliest of choices. Think about it. And it just is so upsetting to me throughout this whole experience to watch the commoditization of life and to put Israel and the Jewish people in the most difficult situation to negotiate for the lives of people that were taken in the barbaric way in which they were taken over into Gaza. And that is the most, the devastating thing. But Hamas does not exist on its own. Hamas exists through the help of global organizations. We talked about UNRWA. The day before, 2 days ago, there was a bold strike by the IDF in Qatar. A very dangerous move at this point. But let's face it, Qatar is really, the head of the snake when it comes to the Bank of Hamas. And they have played both sides. They have harbored terrorists. They have funneled financing terrorists, and they have the gall to be the negotiators of peace. And then, of course, you've got world leaders surrounding them and legitimizing and giving credit to these negotiation process and to putting them as mediators. Yet they're fully responsible. They're fully responsible, and they're bribing. They're bribing. The U.S. President Trump gets a plane. I don't know if he ever got the plane. I don't know if ever he's going to get the plane. Right, $400 million plane. I'd like one of those things. But the point is that I think that Israel's military actions are bold. I think 2 days ago the strike on Qatar was justified. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would. I think we could very clearly make the case that Qatar are, if not combatants in this war, about as close as it's possible to be, especially if we look at the information side of things, where this global campaign to delegitimize the state of Israel is absolutely generated and is catalyzed by things like Al Jazeera. And Qatar have played an incredibly clever game. And one of the unfortunate side effects from the strikes this week is that Qatar have come out of it almost with their reputations enhanced and with global solidarity with Qatar rather than anyone else, because they've presented themselves as a kind of victim of Israeli aggression, because they have this incredible propaganda machine that they run. And then on top of that, they have basically bought half of London. As you say, they've invested significant money into the United States. They've also, through the Muslim Brotherhood, funded an absolute subversion of our universities, of our media. And they're in an incredibly strong position. And yet praising them for their negotiation is akin to praising an arsonist because the arsonist called the fire brigade after setting fire to the house. This is
excellent.
This is in no way.
I really like that analogy. Andrew Fox, why would you end up in Gaza? You're a former British paratrooper. What is your interest in? You're not Jewish, right? You're
no, I'm not.
Right, and yet you've gone to Gaza 3 times. It must be a great risk. I'd like to understand why you went to Gaza, who brought you to Gaza, and what did you achieve by going there?
So, Mike, this is a long story in some ways. My journey towards this came through Afghanistan. When Kabul fell, I was heavily involved in efforts as a civilian to rescue former Afghan colleagues who were under risk from the Taliban when they took back over. And a bunch of us set up a kind of loose collective charity where we ended up rescuing about 3,000 Afghans, mostly women and children. And we couldn't have done it. We couldn't have done it without the UK's Jewish community. They gave us the charity infrastructure that we needed. They gave us the legal advice we needed to make sure we didn't accidentally people smuggle, because that's quite easily done, it turns out. I didn't know this at the time, but they gave us that protection. So I had good friends in the Jewish community from that period. And then, of course, October the 7th happened. Now, I had a small media platform because my army regiment were in a documentary which followed my company as we were running around doing cool stuff. So I had a small media following from that, and I used that platform to speak up for my Jewish friends and try and speak up against the tide of anti-Semitism that we saw here in the UK that started on 7th of October with celebrations in London. And that steadfast support got me an invitation to Israel.
Okay.
Sorry.
The tidal wave of anti-Semitism, this tsunami of anti-Semitism that happened on October 8th moving forward, when you would expect the world to stand up for Israel and to say that, hey, this is a horrible thing. It was as if everything was planned. It was as if everything was coordinated beforehand. So Andrew, so you went out to Gaza. You obviously you've made arrangements to go in there. You were deep inside of Gaza during some of the worst fighting. What was if you had some takeaways? What was your 3 observations? And here's what I want to understand. I want to understand that each time that you went to Gaza, what was the delta in your observation of what had been achieved, what had been lost, or sort of what did you come away with? What was your key takeaways?
So I've got a 20,000 word paper on this coming out next month, which is my lessons for the West from Gaza, from the IDF. I think the first key takeaway is what we call transformation in contact. I think that is a remarkable achievement by the IDF. They weren't ready for October the 7th, and I think that's not giving away any state secrets. I think the fact that reserve units were having to get donated body armor and boots and all that kind of thing shows that there wasn't, that there was a lot of stuff that wasn't ready to conduct a 2-division assault into Gaza City. And of course, the IDF isn't designed to do that sort of thing anyway, so they've had to effectively relearn their entire doctrine. They have an incredible lessons learned set up within the IDF, where every brigade, division, headquarters has a lessons learned team, and they're really good at finding the lessons, and not only that, but then disseminating them across the whole force to make sure that everyone is learning. And the best example is the tunnels. If you look at how long it took to clear some of the tunnels initially, they're able to do it 10 times faster now because the IDF has perfected simultaneous above ground and below ground maneuver using combined arms assets, which is all a bit military ease. But what it means is they're moving their troops underground and overground at the same time, whilst coordinating all the supporting artillery and drones and helicopters and planes that they need to make that mission successful. And they're doing it fast, and that's all because they've transformed in contact. So that's my biggest, most impressive takeaway, I think, from what the IDF have been doing. Secondly, urban tactics. There's an evolution that we've seen since the start of the war, which has been, I think, quite impressive. The enemy have learned as well, and the IDF has had to adapt accordingly. So things like the use of bulldozers is unprecedented, and as an infantryman, I think fantastic for urban warfare. Nobody else in the world can do that right now.
How are bulldozers being used?
So they're being used for all kinds of stuff, like pushing supplies in a resupply across a junction that might be under fire. They're used for clearing IEDs at scale. They're used for making hasty defensive positions. They've got all kinds of uses, and the IDF is so advanced, they've even got remote control D9 bulldozers now. They're effectively drone dozers, if you want to call them that, which is, again, nobody else has got. And then the third key takeaway, I think, was the attitude of the soldiers, because actually that's one of the things I'm really interested in as I'm doing my PhD on both Gaza and Ukraine and what we can learn from both. Soldiery is, as a former officer, there are 2 kinds of soldiers. There's boots and suits, and I was always a boot. I was never a suit. I was never well suited to staff jobs. I liked being out in the field with my troops and doing that kind of thing. And speaking to the IDF soldiers, what I was really impressed with was, first of all, their understanding of why they were there. The unity of purpose was remarkable. And any soldier you ask gave you the same question. They knew they were defending Israel. They knew October the 7th could never happen again. And they were very, very clear on that mission. And I think if you'd asked some of my soldiers in Afghanistan, they could never have given an answer as clear or as unified as the IDF troops did as to why we were there, what we were doing. I don't know if I could have done, quite frankly, never mind my troops. The next thing was the lack of hatred was surprising in some ways. Like, you would go in there expecting them to have a sort of aggression and a desire to really take the fight in. And actually, they really hated the fact that the civilians were being used as human shields, the fact that, this was a job they were forced to do, the fact that people's homes and stuff were being destroyed. They felt bad about that. They didn't want it to happen, but they, again, going back to that unity of purpose, they understood why. But there was a real compassion towards the civilians, which was certainly hugely at odds with global reporting. That doesn't mean they've done everything perfectly. There've certainly been incidences where they've opened fire when they shouldn't, and et cetera, et cetera. But that's every army on the planet. Show me a war in history that doesn't have mistakes or deliberate errors like that coming into it. The IDF's not perfect, but they have done some incredibly good work, and the achievements of the IDF over the last 2 years, I think, are remarkable. And because the campaign is still ongoing, they're not really appreciated. But once there's a ceasefire, whatever it looks like further down the line, I think in reflection, the performance, the operational and tactical performance of the IDF is something that Western armies could really study and learn a lot from, and they will get acclaim for that in due course, I suspect.
Are you, you've been there 3 times, and who are you reporting to? Who are you consulting with the Israeli army? Do you provide advice and guidance and direction? Do you come back to the UK and speak with the government? Like, what is your end game goal here? What is your purpose of reporting, other than being a tremendous humanitarian and being a very caring and empathetic person? We all are, but we're all going and getting our hands dirty inside of Gaza and then come back. What are you doing with this information?
So I'm kind of a year and a half into a career at a think tank, and I'm still at the point where I'm making it up as I go along in some ways, because my ambition in life was to be an officer in the parachute regiment, and I achieved that. So when I left the army, I had to sort of try and work out what on earth I wanted to do with the remaining years of my life. And I have, I think, a passion to explain war to people who don't necessarily have my knowledge or background or understanding. And I like fair reporting, so I try and do that as well. But I have spoken, I've written several papers for the Henry Jackson Society. I publish a lot of stuff on my own Substack. But I have spoken in the British Parliament on a couple of occasions. I've spoken at the French Senate, at the United Nations. And I've been around Europe giving speeches, including places like Norway. I'm off to the Netherlands next month, Norway again, hopefully the United States as well. So I'm trying to, on top of studying for my PhD, I'm trying to be someone who goes to war zones in a way that a lot of people can't. Like most reporters or researchers generally don't get taken as far forward as I do. Like last month, I was in Ukraine, about 6 kilometers from where the fiercest fighting was, near Pokrovsk. And foreign armies don't mind taking me forward because of my military background. They know I can look after myself. I'm not going to be a liability to them. And they know I'm not a journalist, so I don't have an agenda. I don't have anything, any financial kind of demands on my time or my output. So I'm completely neutral. I just call it as I see it, and my job as I see it is to tell the truth as I understand it.
So some would say, and even accuse you, of being a friend of the Jews, of being an ally of Israel. How do you see it? What is your motivation? You just said that you call it as you see it and that you're a purveyor of truth. Would that be a correct statement, that this isn't about a bias, allegiance, or maybe that allegiance is born by truth itself?
I mean, that's what I try to do. Look, if I thought Israel was committing a genocide, I would absolutely say that. And I came back from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and I was quite critical of the fact the IDF were using live fire for crowd control, which is something I'm hugely not a fan of. But, I've actively turned down government money. I was invited to a conference in Jerusalem. It would have been government-funded flights and hotels, and I refused that and paid for my own.
Who is funding you?
So I'm paid through the Henry Jackson Society as an associate fellow, and the rest of my income comes from my Substack. That's who pays me.
Have said that, he must be paid by the IDF or the Israeli government to be sort of, but you're saying that's absolutely untrue. You've never taken any money to, and I think this is an important point. You'll excuse me, and I do so with respect, but I think it's an important point over here because truth has a way of being manipulated by finances, and we see that everywhere. And I want to make it very clear over here to our audience that if you seem like a friend of the Jews, or an ally of Israel, that this is coming from the fact that you are a seeker of truth and that you are not receiving any financial compensation for the work that you do that happens to be in support of Israel. But if you saw something that you disagreed with, you'd also have no problem. You've just mentioned something as well about that. And so thank you very much, sir. Thank you for being a outspoken person, somebody who pursues truth. This is a big problem in today's world, in a world gone mad. And we just lost yesterday, and I have to, talk about it. Probably one of the most phenomenal young people out there who captured the youth of America and who taught us something very special about calmly defying the untruths and the lies and the bias. And Charlie Kirk was an incredible human being who was cut down. When they run out of the ability to debate, they turn to violence. You've talked about 9/11 today to recognize on the day that we're recording this is 9/11. Isn't that paradoxical in a way, to the sense that here we are sitting here having not learned from history? Do you believe that the world hasn't learned from history, or do you believe that history just repeats itself?
I think in the West, we're still recovering from that punch in the mouth. And it's a good analogy, that, because somebody said it was like that New York had its front teeth knocked out. So punch in the mouth, I think, works. I think there was a global complacency after the end of the Cold War, where we assumed that, and there are even articles written by people like Francis Fukuyama saying it was the end of history, and there was going to be no more war, and the liberal order had won. And we took our eye off the ball for a decade. 9/11 happened, and we found ourselves bogged down into these kind of strategically mucky campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq. Iraq, of course, caused huge ripples all around the Middle East, and I think a lot of what we see today is a direct consequence of the war in Iraq. And we're still recovering from that period. And in that time when we had our eye on the Middle East and on Afghanistan, our enemies were using that time to build and look at us and look at our strengths and look at how they could undermine us. And I think we're now seeing the fruits of that undermining. I think if we look at how toxic the debate in America is now, I think it's, and obviously the apotheosis of that is what happened to Charlie Kirk yesterday. The kind of polarization of that debate is undeniably driven by, to a degree, by malign actors online who are pushing false narratives, who are pushing disinformation, who are targeting particularly the youth through universities and through the social media platforms that they use, like TikTok. It's not entirely because of that. There are, of course, other factors involved, both socioeconomic and others. But there has certainly been a sustained assault on the West since 9/11 that we haven't really even woken up to yet. So it's a scary and challenging new world.
It's an absolute mystery to me of this sort of transformation over the last 25 years, of this opening of the gateway to the very people that murdered us. I mean, I want to make sure that I know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to ask you, 9/11, would you say that was the entry point where the world learned about what jihad is about? Would you say that was a result of jihadism? And I don't think prior to 9/11 we really appreciated what jihadism was about. But would you say that was the entry for jihadism?
Certainly that kind of Salafist jihadism. Obviously there were the kind of, it was masked in many ways before that by its links to the Soviet Union. Islamic extremism isn't new. but it's the first time it came out in the open on its own. It was its first steps of, independent of
We can agree
a
that it's
patron.
an Islamic initiative. It was a initiative by someone of Islam, in the name of Islam, in the false gods that they claimed that they were doing God's work. It wasn't like, we want to expand into America, we want to take over America. This was a jihadist act. It was a terrible, terrible thing. The other day, in fact, yesterday, I was in New York City, and I walked around the World Trade Center in the memorial, and they've got the perpetual waterfalls where the two buildings stood. It's a very powerful place to be. If anyone hasn't been there, you should definitely see it. It's a moment to read every single name of the 3,700 people who perished that day. And of course, not to mention the many, many thousands upon thousands of people whose lives were affected. And you would think that this would have been the wake-up call for America. I mean, you couldn't have it either way. And yet, within a very short period of time, the next term that I'm hearing about is Islamophobia, is how the world is becoming. You have to become politically correct. And the DEI movement and everything like that came out, and BDS and all the different acronyms that are all really a subversive element of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel rhetoric and anti-Western rhetoric, and where it was, essentially manipulating the liberal left, because we completely missed it. And so you would think that after an event like this, for the next 100 years, we would become highly protectionist and highly aware and highly concerned when it came to this. And yet, the really interesting thing is that the turnaround is that we end up becoming sensitive to the idea of Islam. And we come up with terminology that that penalizes people for calling out what it is. And over the last 25 years, this happens. And then October 7th happens. And what do? Leaders of Western countries, of the free world, of the same people who lost members of their family, who lost friends, who lost in 9/11, come out and say that we support the establishment of a Palestinian state, a world gone mad. What do you make of all this?
I mean, it's a big topic to grasp, radical Islam. And I think if we go back to how this happened, money talks. Money talks. Qatar is an incredibly rich country. They have the ability to fund the Muslim Brotherhood as it goes around the world. And it's a tricky one to crack down on, because they talk in wonderful terms about how they eschew violence. They don't, they don't want a violent jihad, but actually they can be in many ways even more subversive, because they make our own people inclined to fight us, even if they don't do the fighting. They kind of wind them up and then send them off. It's a really difficult thing to counter, but unfortunately, those Qatari billions have really done their job.
And Andrew, where did those billions come from? That Qatar and Saudi Arabia and all these pan-Arab countries that were completely poor 80 years ago. Every time we turn on the ignition of our cars, we pay
them. We pay them for their natural. So it's our money being used against us, effectively. And Stephen Thompson and I wrote something like that very recently.
It's just madness, and I just don't get it. I don't know why people. That's why I do this podcast, because I'm trying to understand it myself. In a world gone mad, I'm trying to understand, why is it that we're such sadomasochists, and why do we bite our nose to spite our face, and why do we have these self-destruction? We have one of the most advanced societies of all time, where with quality of life in Western free world is absolutely phenomenal at any given time in history, and yet we have forces. 50% of America are leaning to open the door to this and let this in. I don't know, but if someone knocked down 2 towers and killed 3,500 of my citizens, I don't think I would have invited them back into my house. But that's exactly what happened. And now, 25 years later, assassination of Charlie Kirk for talking about the truth. Thank you, America. Thank you, people who want to destroy America, want to destroy free world. It's not just about America, it's about freedom. And it's about our freedom. And yet, it just seems, I see it all the time when I'm in the UK, when I'm in London. I see it on the streets of Oxford. How do they allow thousands and tens of thousands of people who are propping up the lovers of death in the very city that gives life? It is just, it boggles my mind. I don't think you have an answer. I don't think I have an answer. I think the only thing we do is leave evidence for history. So that,
I mean, it's just political mismanagement over 2 decades, I think. But I think you hit on something quite interesting. You know, you talked about the end state being destruction, and I think that's why the Red-Green Alliance are currently in this marriage of convenience, because my goodness, their goals are different. You know, they could not be more different in terms of goals, in terms of what they actually want to achieve. But they all have a destructive outlook, and I think that's what brings them together. In some ways, they think that the countries we live in are terrible and need to be torn down and built anew. Now, one wants to build it anew in one way, one wants to build it up in another way, but they all agree about the tearing down. And that's where we see that unity of red and green, which is something I've struggled to get my head around. If you look at Azra Nomani's writings, do you know Azra? She's an incredible journalist, and her book about the Red-Green Alliance is remarkable. It's a very, very strange phenomenon.
It is something I can't get my head around, and I find it, the paradox of seeing a feminist standing next to a woman in a hijab, and here you have two. You can't have two diametrically more opposed ideology people who stand, and yet they are united in destruction. They are united for destruction, and it just doesn't make any sense to me when I see Queers for Palestine marching through the street. Good luck in Ramallah, maybe 3 seconds. When I see humanists, people who really have spent their careers fighting for civil liberties, who are supporting what in effect is a promotion of Sharia law, it really is a world gone mad. And I think that we're really lacking something in this world. I think that there must be a reason behind this. There must be a reason that we are seeking the destruction of ourselves, generally speaking, through supporting this destructive source. And I'm trying to figure out, what is it that we're missing? Is it a lack of religion? Is it a lack of God in people, like the young kids? Is it too much entertainment? Is it lack of discipline? Is it the drug culture of the 60s? What has brought us to this place where we are scraping the bottom of the proverbial barrel when it comes to dissonance and contradiction and bias that only serve at the end of the day, as history will tell us? And I go back 25 years to 9/11, but we can go back thousands of years with many examples of how society has come to its pinnacle only to destroy itself and eat itself alive. Andrew Fox, what are we missing in our lives that brings us to this point of devastation, contradiction, and complete confusion?
I think we're missing something that brings us together. I think it's been, what are we coalescing behind here as a society? I think we've lost that message. I think perhaps Ronald Reagan was maybe the last time that was really clearly articulated about what America stood for, and he articulated that in the context of the Cold War and standing against the USSR, standing for freedom, for liberty, and those being the fundamental principles that humanity craves, and therefore that's what America stands for. I mean, I think if you try to ask what America stands for now, that would be very challenging. And I think it's the same with the United Kingdom. And then you layer onto that these kind of Gramscian theories that kind of tell our young people that everything about our countries is bad. It's unjust, it's unfair, it's, you could go for any kind of phobia that you want to attach to it. It's colonialist. This narrative is incredibly dangerous, because it tells our people that They shouldn't be proud of being Americans. They shouldn't be proud of being British. These are things to be ashamed of. America is to be ashamed of. The UK is to be ashamed of. And then you combine that with mass immigration from other cultures, and it just creates this boiling pot where we just lose a sense of who we are as a nation state. And you might even be able to include, I think, and I don't want to go down the sort of globalist agenda rabbit hole, but you do have institutions like the United Nations, like the European Union, which are specifically there to try and undermine the nation state by design, because the nation state led us to 2 world wars in half a century. And they have done that job quite well. So we have this sort of internationalist perspective as well, where, international law for some people is above national law that you vote for. It's a holy grail. And actually our government in the UK actually hold that opinion at the moment. So you layer all of these things onto each other.
Do you think that it's only a matter of time for the UK to have eaten itself out, so to speak? I mean, your new, is it the Minister of State, Minister for Crime and Policing? Is that who the newest?
Oh, the Home Secretary. Yeah, the Home Secretary.
And are we talking about the same person? She is a devout Muslim.
Yes, Shabana Mahmood is her name.
She has been seen at protests that have called for the destruction of the state of Israel, and she is now in charge of the justice system in the UK.
She is. And look, she said some very dodgy things at Palestinian marches as well, like calling on people to get groups of 20 to go and mob MPs' surgeries. It's all very uncomfortable. But actually, it's not Shabana Mahmood, the Muslim, that's a problem. It's the Labour Party, because they've been anti-Semitic for years under Jeremy Corbyn. They were condemned nationally for their anti-Semitism. If we look at what Emily Thornberry, who was I think she was a minister until recently. I think she's on one of the committees. She's a committee member. But she said she saw Abu Mazen in London and said, "I promised you a few years ago that we'd recognise a Palestinian state. I'm so sorry it's taken so long." That was her comment to Mahmoud Abbas.
How does that make you feel as someone who's dedicated your life to the defense of the British people? Where does that leave you?
Yeah, I wonder why I bothered. If I'm genuinely honest, I wouldn't join the army today. If I had my time again, if it was 2025 and I was 24 years old, I probably wouldn't do it again. Certainly not for this terrible government that we have in the United Kingdom. Like I said, they prioritise international law over anything, including the national interest. They are corrupted with anti-Semitism, and there is the next election to get rid of them cannot come soon enough, and I worry the damage may be too severe by the time we get there. But at the moment, it's a sad state.
I understand that there are areas in London or in the UK that are completely governed under Sharia law.
No, I don't think that's quite accurate. I think that's a little bit of an internet exaggeration. There's certainly no area of London that I wouldn't feel comfortable going to, less the levels of crime, but they don't come close to some US cities in terms of crime in London. So,
are you concerned? Are you concerned about the future of your country?
I am. Yes.
And what do you think 30 years from now? What is your prediction at the current situation? Well,
it depends if enough good people, the optimistic thing for me is the silent majority. Because they're still silent at the moment, and there will come a point where they're not. And I think at that point, it goes one of two ways. We either slide completely off the cliff, or someone pulls us back before it's too late. And really, it could go either way at this point, quite frankly. And that's a scary thing to say. It's probably equally likely to go off a cliff as it is to recover itself. So
I'm concerned, and I'm concerned in Canada with what is going on. And I read an article recently that blasting Trump for moving to protectionist measures that we haven't seen for 80 years. And I responded to the article and I said, well, that is interesting, except we don't live in the same world we lived in 80 years ago. We don't have BRICS that makes up half the world population, that has acquired nuclear weaponry, that has made partnerships with Islamic jihadist ideologues. We don't have a situation where we have completely sold ourselves out for cheap labor, and and put us in the situation that we are in today. So yeah, I mean, I guess the answer to the survival of America is going to be some isolationist and protectionism. I don't think he's off the market, and he's quite off the mark. But I look at what's happened in London. Are you aware of Canada and sort of the 10 million immigrants that we've let in over the last 10 years? I'm a big favorite, and I think it's very important to have a healthy immigration policy. But I also think it's important that we vet the people that are coming into this country. Are you aware of Canada's support of the Muslim Brotherhood, of organizations like Samadun? Do you see Canada along the same trajectory as the UK?
I do. I mean, I was in Canada just earlier this year. I certainly found it quite eye-opening. I thought to a degree that we had it bad. I think potentially Canada has it worse, quite frankly. But I do think there are some serious flaws in the isolationist idea. I think the rest of the world is looking at America as if they're mad right now. I think there is a Trump is mad? Particularly because if we frame things in terms of power, you get a lot of power through alliances, and Trump has certainly alienated a number of countries that could have been quite useful. India, rather than try and bring them inside the tent, he's driven them into the arms of China. And I think these are strategically very short-sighted decisions. But you have to try and work out where your priorities are. I suspect isolationism will make America poorer, but potentially their borders more secure. So where's your trade-off?
Right, more insulated. You talk about war. You talk about what you're doing. You're a student of war. You're a teacher of war. Recently, I started to read a short book. It's absolutely phenomenal. It is a published discussion between Einstein and Freud called Why War? Have you read that book?
No, I haven't. Interesting. I'll check it out.
I must tell you that it is really eye-opening. It is what happened is that I think it was Freud. It was Einstein who was commissioned by the General Assembly to write a paper or to advise on the concept of war and to answer the question of war and what would be the option, the alternative. And so the idea was to have a governing body that would be a global sort of watchdog, if you will. And the discussion comes up with sort of, two major points come up in the discussion between Einstein and Freud. It's a series of letters in 1933, if you could imagine, 1933, nearly 100 years ago, between these two unbelievable, intellectuals. And at the end of the day, it's the consequence of the human experience, of the very human experience, that brings us to a state of paradox where, in order to pursue peace, we are going to have constant war, because war is based on humanity's need for greed and bias and the realism of what human nature is about. It's a phenomenal book. I would highly suggest you read it. It's called Why War? I'm going through it, and it's a real eye-opener to think that this was a discussion that took place nearly 100 years ago. Andrew Fox, why war?
Well, I come to a similar conclusion. I think it's a feature, not a bug, of humanity. War is a feature of the need to get the best deal for your own particular state. And unfortunately, these things will escalate to violence if there is a fundamental clash of opinion between two countries, and that's what it boils down to. And look at Ukraine as a perfect example. The key, I think, that we've tried to we've tried to use to unlock the problem over the last 50 years was the United Nations, but clearly that is fully subverted now by non-democratic authoritarian states, the majority of the UN membership. And I think the Cold War in many ways gave us a false sense of security. There was always conflict going on all around the world, but it never really escalated to that really big war because there was that fear of nuclear weapons.
And there was the theory of mad, because of course. Right? Because the Russians love their children too. And and it wasn't a conflict based on either side loving life less than the other side. So as long as the whole race to arm and the proliferation of nuclear capabilities came down to the idea of mad, the theory of mad, and that worked up until today. And today we live in a very, very dangerous world when you remove mad, and when when death becomes sort of the ultimate goal, and when you have false gods and radicalized religions, and we know all that, and it's a very scary thing. It's a very scary time. I think as we're coming up sort of on the close here of our podcast today, Andrew Fox, I want to thank you very, very much, Andrew, for your I tend to call people by their first and last names. It's just sort of my thing. I think that really, really very much appreciate your time. There's no question about it. We need people who are seekers of truth. We need people to investigate. I had a wonderful podcast with Thane Rosenbaum, who wrote Disproportionality with respect to the war in Gaza. And I asked him why he does what he does. And he says, because I need to leave evidence. We all need to leave evidence. And that was it really stuck with me, what he said, because the fact is that we do this. I am doing this with you. You are out there doing what you're doing, because ultimately, I don't know if we're going to make a difference. But I do know that we must leave evidence for humanity to follow. Because maybe just like I picked up a book by Einstein and Freud, someone's going to pick up, Andrew, your 20,000 word essay on the lessons learned by what happened in Gaza. And maybe just by chance, somebody later is going to watch this episode between you and I. And maybe it will affect decisions, and maybe it'll affect outcomes. But I don't think it's one particular person. I don't think it's one particular conversation. I think it's the culmination of things. And we have to be courageous. Charlie Kirk was a hero. He had the courage to speak the truth and not use violence as a way to get across his point of view, but rather intellect, rather discourse, reasonable conversations. And so the real question is, can unreasonable people be dealt with? Can unreasonable people be made to see reason through discussion? And this is really a question that remains for everybody out there today, because at one point, we all have an opportunity to be proven wrong. And the answer isn't to take out a gun and shoot the other person, because the real man, the real woman, the real person, if I want to be correct here, is to continue dialogue and continue learning from each other. I've learned a lot from you today, Andrew, and I'm sure that a lot of people are learning from you. I want to wish you Godspeed and safety, and we said God should watch over you in what you do. Thank you very much for doing something that a lot of people don't do, going and risking your life, literally risking your life. And I think that anybody who's outspoken after seeing that horrible scene of when just the moment when you heard the pop and then you saw the blood coming out of his neck, and somebody, any person out there that is talking, this wasn't just about Charlie Kirk. This is about silencing the truth. We cannot afford for the truth to be silenced however it comes out. And every person that does it, as long as there are people out there willing to silence others, you are a hero, my friend. Thank you for coming on The Unfiltered View. For our listeners out there who've watched this episode, our currency is when you share, subscribe, when you like, when you comment. If you want to get this message out there, if you believe that there is something to be said about getting the truth out there, don't be passive. That time is over. Andrew talked about the silent majority. That is, hope is because of the silent majority. If you are part of the silent majority, the time to speak up is now. Silence is not an option. We are in a state of affairs where we are in a world gone mad, and the only way we're going to correct it is through dialogue and speech. Let people know what you think. Like this episode, share it, subscribe, and thank you for listening when you had other choices of what to do, because it's no longer an option. It's no longer an option to remain silent. Andrew, last word, if you had something to say to the world, what would it be?
It would be to reject extremism, seek balance, listen to the other side, and think before you make decisions.
Those are very powerful words. Let's hope people listen. Thank you very much, Andrew Fox. And thank you again for listening to The Unfiltered View.
My name is Israel Ellis, and this is The Unfiltered View, a companion to the wake-up call. This is where truth breaks through the noise.